had always prided myself on being a man of logic and reason. Superstitions and ghost stories were mere fabrications, the stuff of childish fantasies and idle gossip. That was until I moved into my new home, a grand old Victorian house that seemed to breathe with history. It was perfect, or so I thought, until the noises began. It started subtly, like a whisper in the night. At first, it was just a soft scratching sound from the basement, dismissed as nothing more than mice or the settling of an old house. But as the nights wore on, the scratching grew louder, more persistent. It was no longer a mere whisper, but a relentless cacophony that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. The once serene quiet of my home became a symphony of dread, scratching, thumping, dragging, each sound more insistent than the last. Sleep eluded me. I lay awake night after night, my mind racing through increasingly irrational fears. The scratching seemed to follow me, growing louder with each passing hour. I could almost feel it, a malevolent presence lurking just beyond the threshold of my understanding. One particularly harrowing night, driven by a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity, I decided enough was enough. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a hammer, I ventured into the basement, each step echoing with the creaks of the old wooden stairs. The basement air was thick and cold, carrying with it a heavy smell of mildew and something else, something vaguely metallic that made my stomach churn. The beam of my flashlight swept across the damp, crumbling walls, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. The scratching had ceased, replaced by a suffocating silence that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Just as I began to doubt my own sanity, I heard it, a low, guttural growl emanating from the far corner of the basement, hidden in darkness. My heart pounded, each beat a desperate plea for safety as I turned, the flashlight beam trembling with my fear. The light fell upon a small wooden door I had never noticed before, partially concealed behind a stack of old boxes. The growling was louder now, almost urgent. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I approached the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. The vibration on the other side of the door was palpable, a low humming that resonated deep within my bones, making every nerve in my body scream in terror. With a final shuddering breath, I threw open the door, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The growling stopped abruptly, plunging the room into a silence that was far more terrifying. I stepped into the room, my flashlight revealing a small, sparsely furnished space. A single wooden chair and a table stood in the center, upon which lay a scattering of tools. A hammer, a chisel, a rusty saw. A cold wave of nausea swept over me as I recognized the tools. They were the same tools my grandfather, a renowned butcher, had used in his shop. Memories of his old grimy apron and the bloody rags he would clean his hands with came flooding back. A sense of dread gnawed at my insides as I realized the horrifying truth. The noises, the growling. It wasn't some trapped animal or an overactive imagination. It was something far more sinister, something waiting for me to uncover the truth. The tools, my grandfather's tools, had been waiting. And now, as the darkness seemed to press closer, I knew with a chilling certainty that I was not alone. The silence grew oppressive, heavy with the weight of something unseen, but palpably present. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls, mocking my terror. The vibration from behind the door grew stronger, more insistent, as if the room itself was alive with a dark hunger. In that moment, I felt a cold hand close around my heart, squeezing with a suffocating grip. I knew that something dark and hungry had awakened, something that had been waiting patiently in the shadows, and it knew my name. The basement, my once quiet sanctuary, had transformed into a sinister playground of dread. I was no longer alone. The darkness had a voice, and it was calling for me. I still remember the first time I laid eyes on that cursed house. It was on the outskirts of a forgotten town, nestled in a valley that seemed perpetually shrouded in mist. The locals avoided it like the plague, their eyes widening in fear whenever its name was mentioned. They whispered about the house, about the unspeakable things that had happened within its walls, about the madness that had taken root there so many years ago. But it wasn't the warnings that scared us away. No, it was the allure of the unknown, the thrill of uncovering something dark and forgotten that drew us in. It was a chilly autumn evening when we decided to go, Mark, Emily, Chris, Jessica, and I. We were young, foolish, driven by a sense of invincibility that only youth can afford. Armed with flashlights and a mix of nervous excitement, we crossed the threshold into the house's desolate embrace. The moment we stepped inside, the air changed. It was heavy, thick with the scent of rot and decay, a smell that seemed to cling to our clothes and skin. Dust lay thick on every surface, and cobwebs draped the doorways like curtains in some twisted theater. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the creaking of old wood beneath our feet. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. As we moved deeper into the house, we were drawn to the basement door, an old wooden thing hanging slightly ajar. The air grew colder as we descended the stairs, each step echoing ominously in the stillness. The basement was nothing more than a dirt floor, cold and damp beneath our feet. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing walls covered in strange, faded symbols. Emily, always the bookworm, gasped when she saw them. "These are wards," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Symbols of protection against something evil." We should have left right then, turned around, and never looked back. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and it held us fast. We approached a small wooden table in the center of the room. Its surface was edged with the same symbols, though these were deeper, angrier, as if carved with a desperate hand. A chill ran down my spine, a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature. Then, without warning, the temperature plummeted further, and a gust of icy wind whipped through the basement, though all the doors and windows were sealed. Our flashlights flickered, then died, plunging us into a darkness so complete. It felt suffocating. Panic seized me. I fumbled with my flashlight, my fingers numb with fear, but it wouldn't turn on. Chris was the first to get his light working again. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a figure at the far end of the basement. My heart stopped. It was tall, skeletal, its skin stretched tight over bone, and its eyes. Those eyes burned with a red light, like embers in a dying fire. They locked onto us, and I felt a wave of pure terror wash over me. It took a step toward us, and I swear I felt the air thicken, as if the house itself was trying to swallow us whole. Its hand, skeletal and grotesque, reached out, the fingers curling as if to grab hold of us. The closer it got, the harder it became to breathe. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by a fear so intense it felt like my heart might stop. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The basement was plunged back into darkness, but the cold remained, seeping into my bones. I could hear my friends breathing heavily, could feel the panic rising again as we scrambled to our feet. We didn't need to speak. We all knew we had to get out, and fast. We ran, tripping over each other in our haste to reach the stairs. The house seemed to groan around us, the floorboards creaking under the weight of something unseen. As we burst out of the front door and into the night, the cold air hit us like a slap, sharp and jarring. We didn't stop running until we were far from that place, our breath coming in ragged gasps, our hearts pounding in our chests. But even as we caught our breath, a sound reached our ears, a laugh, cold and hollow, echoing from the depths of that abandoned house. It followed us, haunting our steps long after we had fled, a reminder of the darkness we had awakened. I don't know what that figure was, or what it wanted, but I do know one thing. That house is alive. It feeds on fear, on the darkness within us, and it's waiting for the next group of fools to cross its threshold, to descend into its basement, waiting to consume them, just as it almost consumed us. Moving into the old Victorian house was supposed to be a fresh start for us, a chance to leave behind the chaos of the city and embrace the serenity of the countryside. My parents, ever the romantics, had fallen in love with the place the moment they laid eyes on it. Its towering spires, intricate woodwork, and wraparound porch were straight out of a fairy tale. But as we unpacked our things, that fairy tale began to feel more like a Gothic novel, one with a foreboding presence that hung in the air like a storm cloud. I was only 10 at the time, but I knew something was off. It wasn't just the creaky floors or the way the house groaned in the wind. There was something else, something deeper. The first thing I noticed was the smell, a musty odor that seemed to cling to the air near the basement door. It was faint at first, just a whiff here and there, but it grew stronger, more pungent, until it was impossible to ignore. I tried asking my parents about it, but they brushed it off, saying it was probably just an old house smell. But I knew better. The sounds started a few days later. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the hum of the house. It was like scratching, or maybe the rustling of papers coming from the walls. I thought it might be rats or maybe even squirrels in the attic, but the sounds seemed too deliberate, too rhythmic. They didn't stop, even late at night when the house was deathly quiet. I lay in bed, the sheets pulled up to my chin, listening to the faint tapping that seemed to move from room to room, always just out of reach. One evening, while my parents were busy unpacking in the kitchen, I decided to explore. I had a flashlight, one of those heavy-duty ones that could blind a person if shined in their eyes. I felt braver with it in my hand, like nothing could harm me as long as I kept the beam steady. I started with the living room, which was mostly empty except for a few boxes and an old threadbare rug that had come with the house. Something about that rug bothered me. It didn't fit with the rest of the room, which was all polished wood and elegant furniture. The rug was faded and worn, like it had been there for decades, maybe even longer. My heart raced as I approached it, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I knelt down and tugged at the edge of the rug. It was heavier than I expected, like it was weighted down by something underneath. I pulled harder, and with a groan, the rug slid to the side, revealing a trapdoor. The wood was old and splintered, and the metal latch was rusted, but it wasn't locked. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the latch. Something in my gut told me to leave it alone, to put the rug back and pretend I never saw it. But curiosity won out. The trapdoor creaked open with a sound that sent shivers down my spine. A set of rickety wooden stairs descended into the darkness below. A cold, damp air wafted up from the basement, carrying with it the smell of decay and something else, something I couldn't quite place. It was like the scent of old books mixed with rot, a smell that seemed to cling to my skin. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I was just being silly, I told myself. It was just a basement, probably full of old junk and cobwebs. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to step into something I couldn't come back from. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were jars filled with things. I couldn't tell what was inside, but they were cloudy, their contents floating in some kind of liquid that had turned a sickly yellow over time. There were tools, too, strange ones that looked like they belonged in a medieval torture chamber rather than a basement. And then there were the books, dozens of them, their leather covers cracked and worn. At the far end of the basement was a small wooden table. On it sat a single candle, its flame flickering in the drafty air. Next to the candle was an open book. I felt a pull, like an invisible hand guiding me toward it. The book was old, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. The words on the page were written in a language I didn't recognize, but they seemed to writhe and twist before my eyes, forming shapes and patterns that made my head spin. As I stared at the book, the candle suddenly flickered and went out, plunging the basement into complete darkness. Panic surged through me and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I spun around, my flashlight beam swinging wildly through the dark. But there was nothing, just the empty basement and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I bolted up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I slammed the trapdoor shut and threw the rug back over it, as if that could somehow keep whatever was down there from following me. My parents found me moments later, pale and shaking. I tried to tell them what I had seen, what I had felt, but the words wouldn't come out right. They didn't believe me, of course. My father even went down into the basement himself, his own flashlight cutting through the gloom. He came back up a few minutes later, his face pale but composed. "There's nothing down there," he said, his voice shaking slightly. Nothing at all. But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. The basement held a darkness that went beyond the absence of light, a darkness that whispered of ancient secrets and forgotten horrors. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that whatever lurked in the shadows wasn't finished with us. Not yet. As we resurface from these tales of basement terrors, remember the chilling truth. Fear often lurks where we least expect it, in the shadows beneath our feet. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the abyss. If you dared to enjoy these stories, leave a like and tell us in the comments which one kept you awake, dreading the darkness beneath your own home. And remember to subscribe for more terrifying tales from the crypt.